Welcome to this voyage through one of the most eerie tales the region has ever seen. Hollow Creek was just another remote property set among wooded hills where solitude lingered like heavy fog over forgotten valleys. However, there was always something odd about that location, as though the soil itself had secrets that no ledger could ever uncover. This film was made only for amusement and is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to genuine persons, alive or dead, is totally coincidental. The Ozarks area has long been recognized as a region where families have lived apart from cities for many generations, and where time passes slowly. Hollow Creek was located in a very isolated valley in Webster County, accessible only by dirt roads that snaked through deep oak and walnut forests during the winter of 1908, when snow covered the trails and made the area into a truly inhospitable territory. Few ventured there. The property belonged to a family that kept its doors locked to guests and developed a reputation for solitude. That interested the citizens of adjacent communities. No one knew exactly when the first whispers began to circulate, possibly in the taverns of Springfield, where travelers exchanged stories over crackling fireplaces. Perhaps in the markets of Marshfield, where merchants traded gossip along with commodities. The fact is that something weird was happening in Hollow Creek, something that prevented even the most courageous people from traveling through those regions after dusk. There were reports of lights dancing amid the trees when no one should be awake, of sounds booming down the valley without obvious reason, of weird traces found in the fresh snow around the main house. The home was a solid, dark timber structure with 2 stories and a veranda that ringed the entire front. Tall, narrow windows seemed to observe approaching with distrust, and the fading paint gave the property an impression of neglect, even when inhabited. In the back there stood a red barn whose planks moaned in the wind, and a series of smaller buildings whose purpose no one, from the outside, knew well. A stream cut across the property, giving the settlement its name, but its waters ran dark even on the brightest days, as if carrying something heavier than plain debris. The occupants maintained little interaction with the outside world. They bought supplies occasionally in adjacent towns, always secretly, always in a rush, as if every minute away from the farm signified some kind of danger. When someone tried to strike up a conversation, the answers were monosyllabic and the gaze brief. This attitude further stoked the interest of others and made Hollow Creek into a kind of local mythology, a location everyone talked about, but few fully knew. The Marshfield Chronicle newspaper periodically mentioned the property in brief remarks, never with substantive details, always with that air of mystery that journalists use when they wish to infer more than to state. There were mentions of extraordinary happenings and incidents that defied explanation, but nothing definite enough to construct a coherent picture. County records showed that the property had changed hands multiple times throughout the decades, always for below-market values, always with rapid transactions that suggested the sellers were in a rush to get rid of that land. As the winter of 1908 continued, the stories grew increasingly dramatic. Travelers passing along the main road reported seeing individuals moving among the trees toward Hollow Creek, even when blizzards rendered any movement almost impossible. Others swore they had heard voices carried by the wind, whispered talks that made no sense, but sent unexplained shivers down their spines. The atmosphere around the property appeared filled with something intangible, a tension that hung in the air like electricity before a storm. We began to realize that Hollow Creek wasn't just another secluded location. It was an enigma buried in layers of silence and secrets, where every shadow contained disquieting possibilities, and where the boundary between the real and the imagined became dangerously thin. The property waited calmly, as it always has, while its reputation increased and spread through the surrounding towns like a black stain on an already bleak map. Spring arrived, bringing the thaw and with it new mystery surrounding the property. The waters of Hollow Creek began to flow more strongly, washing away the piled snow and revealing the damp dirt beneath. It was around this time that several residents of the region noted slight changes in the conduct of the property's inhabitants. They began to be seen more regularly on the highways, always carrying suitcases and boxes, usually with that strained face that conveyed haste. The foliage around the main house seemed to have grown unevenly during the winter, generating unusual patterns that drew the eye of passing by. Some trees had lost leaves asymmetrically, while others remained lush and green even when sunlight hardly reached. The front yard, formerly poorly cared for, now displayed indications of utter neglect, with weeds taking over the flower beds and vines climbing the porch columns in an almost aggressive manner. Over the following weeks, Marshfield shopkeepers began commenting on unusual purchases made by Hollow Creek residents. Large quantities of salt, superfluous candles, heavy ropes, and other stuff that seemed disproportionate to a typical household. No one asked direct questions, of course, but eyebrows were raised and glances exchanged as those silent figures departed the shops heavy with cryptic stuff. In the spring of 1909, the local weather was especially erratic. Storms would appear out of nowhere, turning the sky into a murky mass and unleashed torrential rains that left the roadways unusable for days. During these storms, inhabitants of the nearby surrounding houses reported seeing lights flashing in the windows of Hollow Creek in random patterns, as if someone was signaling or performing some type of midnight ritual. The intensity of these lights varied, sometimes faint and flickering like candles, other times strong and consistent as if driven by a more powerful source. The red barn in the back of the property became a focus, especially interesting. Its doors remained shut even during the day, and metallic sounds periodically echoed from within, suggesting some kind of labor being carried out away from prying eyes. The external boards showed dark stains that could simply be mold and natural wood deterioration, but which under certain light looked to form almost purposeful designs, symbols that made no instant sense, but evoked unexplained anxiety in anyone who viewed them for an extended period. The Hollow Creek family followed a set schedule. That challenged the customary standards of the period. While farmers woke with the sun to tend to crops and animals, the people of that land seemed more busy at night. Smoke rose from the chimney at unusual hours, and the scent that occasionally traveled down the valley had strange characteristics. A blend of charred wood with something more pungent and indefinable that made the neighbors close their windows, even on warm nights. Mail received regularly at Hollow Creek, always from senders in. Remote places. The letters appeared to have more than simply written messages because they were heavy and dense. Those who occasionally needed to transport something to the property acquired the habit of putting things in the mailbox at the beginning of the driveway, refusing to go up to the main house after a few experiences that they preferred not to explain, but which had plainly left them unsettled. As the months went by, Hollow Creek's reputation hardened as a location to be avoided. Hunters who used to wander. Such forests in search of deer and wild boar began to choose other territory. Lumberjacks operating in the neighboring areas made a point of concluding their workdays before midnight and never, under any circumstances, approached the property's limits. There was a general perception that stepping over that invisible border meant going into areas where reality's usual laws did not fully apply. The tiny constructions dispersed over the grounds added layers to the mystery. One appeared to be an old workshop with planks nailed from the inside covering the windows. Another structure resembled a warehouse, but its proportions suggested it might serve more complex tasks. Additionally, there appeared to be a well surrounded by a decaying wooden building. Grass never grew around it, leaving just compacted soil in the shape of a perfect circle. The animals in the region also demonstrated unique behavior toward Hollow Creek. Horses refused to cross the road leading to the property, bloating and neighing uneasily even when whipped. When they got close to the boundaries of those lands, hunting dogs that would typically eagerly follow any trail suddenly halted, drooping their ears and pulling back with their tails between their legs. Birds avoided making nests in the trees nearest to the home, preferring the more distant regions of the forest. During full moon nights, the property seemed to come alive. Shadows moved in ways that didn't correspond to any visible light source. The wind that blew down the valley carried murmurs that seemed to form, words from long-gone, lost languages. The trees bent and creaked even when there wasn't enough breeze to explain such movement. It felt as if the earth itself breathed, expanding and contracting in a steady, unnerving cadence. Hollow Creek's inhabitants were seldom ever seen at all. When one went out to town, the others remained on the farm. This continual rotation generated the idea that someone always needed to stay behind guarding something, guarding over some secret that couldn't be left unchecked. They constantly wore thick, dark clothing that was inappropriate for the sweltering springtime heat, as though they carried an inner chill that could not be dispelled by the outside warmth. There were indications of increasing deterioration on the property's access road. Potholes formed overnight. Tree roots broke through the compacted clay, creating perilous barriers, while puddles of water lingered even days after rain, as if the soil refused to absorb rainfall. It seemed as though the road itself was attempting to deter tourists, growing more impossible and hostile. Hollow Creek, a stationary point of oddity in a world that changed all around it, remained unaltered in its gloomy aura despite the season's never-ending dance. The property waited, silent and patient, while its history deepened into ever darker and more impenetrable layers. The oppressive heat of summer descended upon the Ozarks like a thick, wet blanket. Even with light gusts, the trees surrounding Hollow Creek stayed oddly motionless, their foliage hanging lifelessly. Disturbed the vegetation of surrounding homes. The creek that cut across the land continued to run with its black waters, but now its murmur seemed to convey a new, almost mournful tone, as if grieving secrets it concealed in its rocky bed. It was at this period that a succession of unusual events began to weave an even more convoluted web around the property. Travelers who had to pass close by complained of odd feelings, such as an unseen weight pushing on their chests and making it challenging to breathe. Some mentioned unexplainable dizziness. Others talked of sudden mental bewilderment, where they lost their sense of direction, even on roads they knew fully. It seemed as if the very environment around Hollow Creek was infused with something that affected not only the senses, but also the capacity to think coherently. The main house began to show symptoms of alteration. Windows that had earlier stayed open during the day were now always closed with heavy drapes restricting any view of the interior. Once, the veranda, simply ignored, was now entirely covered in climbing plants that had grown at an abnormal rate, forming a sort of green wall that further separated the building's facade. The floorboards of the cabin moaned and creaked even when no one walked on them, as if the aged wood were adjusting to invisible forces. The residents of Hollow Creek escalated their nightly trips to specific spots on the land. Those who were courageous enough to set up shop on the nearby slopes after dark might see lantern-wielding individuals traveling through the different structures. These motions followed regular, almost ritualistic patterns, always beginning at the main house, moving by the red barn, then the smaller structures, and finally converging on a location near the back of the property, where the foliage was denser and the shadows deeper. Something different occurred during a particularly oppressive July night in 1909, when it felt impossible to breathe. A weird light radiated from various windows of the residence. At the same time, not the conventional orange-yellow of oil lamps, but a pulsating greenish hue that seemed alive, breathing in unison with some hidden rhythm. Before dawn, this light unexpectedly faded, plunging the property into an even deeper blackness than the surrounding night. It had been visible for several hours, even from a vast distance. The stories circulating in the taverns and markets got more intricate and unsettling. Some swore they had seen huge shadows cast against the barn. Walls, silhouettes that did not correlate to any recognized human form. Others reported hearing discordant melodies and chanting in unidentified languages drifting across the valley in the early morning, causing listeners to experience an unavoidable visceral uneasiness. Some even reported of spectral apparitions roving the property's bounds, translucent forms that vanished when examined directly. The isolation of Hollow Creek people reached terrible extremes. Here, they entirely halted their travels to nearby towns, relying instead on deliveries left at the door to their properties. The orders came from increasingly distant vendors, merchants from neighboring counties prepared to serve consumers who paid lavishly for discretion and punctuality. The contents of these delivery remained a mystery. Large, heavy boxes whose contents no one dared examine. The flora surrounding the home continued its odd change. Flowers that regularly bloomed in vivid shades of red and yellow appeared in tints of dark, purple and almost black-blue. Mushrooms emerged in precise circular shapes, rings that the superstitious of the region knew from ancient European legends carried by immigrants. The grass in certain spots grew tall and wild, while in others it remained short and yellowing, as if something was taking all the vitality from the soil. The covered well in the back of the property had become an object of morbid fascination. The building protecting it looked to have been freshly reinforced, with new timbers contrasting with the old decaying planks. Thick chains had been added, limiting entry with padlocks that sparkled even in the deep evening. The circle of bare soil around the well grew as though something came from those depths, something that kept any kind of vegetation from growing. The sounds that erupted from Hollow Creek during the nights formed part of the region's soundscape. Rhythmic pounding emanated from the barn at random hours, the ropes creaking, strained under invisible weight, the heavy dragging of goods being moved from one side to the other. And always that low, persistent murmur, as if numerous voices were chatting concurrently at a frequency that bordered on aural awareness, more sensed than genuinely heard. Tension in the region rose palpably. Families who had lived on those grounds for generations began to consider migrating, some even selling their properties below market value just to escape the unnerving effect of Hollow Creek. Those who. They devised their own protection rituals, symbols painted on barn doors, horseshoes affixed in precise spots, salt strewn on windowsills. Ancient superstitions received fresh life in the face of the unexplainable. With every moon that passed over the night sky above that lost valley, the property's mysterious presence persisted, a convergence point of strangeness that resisted any attempt at logical comprehension. Autumn arrived, painting the Ozark Hills in shades of golden and scarlet, but the trees around Hollow Creek remained resolutely green, as if refusing to participate in the natural cycle of the seasons. The locals were aware of this anomaly and considered it as another indication of the unsettling influence coming from that cursed land. The evenings became longer and colder, and with them came new phenomena that further strengthened the place's grim reputation. Dense fogs began to build exclusively over the valley where Hollow Creek was located. Low, heavy clouds that drifted across the ground like living beings, wrapping themselves around the structures and hiding them from the view of any outside observer. These fogs had a unique texture, thicker than typical mists, and carried a sweet, sickening odor that clung to the throat of anyone who unintentionally breathed them in. It was at this period that significant structural changes began to place on the property. Low, elongated new buildings that blended in with the surroundings appeared as if overnight. landscape in a manner that is almost organic, as though they were not built by humans but rather sprung from the earth. These structures had no apparent windows, only thick walls of darkish wood and roofs covered in a kind of moss that reflected the moonlight in ghostly bluish tones. The red barn, that edifice that had long been the subject of so much discussion, underwent extraordinary modifications. Its distinctive hue started to fade unevenly, leaving behind stains that resembled pictures on the external boards. From within now came sounds distinct from the typical metallic ones, noises evocative of protracted scratching, like fingernails scraping wood, intermingled with low thumps that made the surrounding ground quiver imperceptibly. The doors remained locked with even more powerful chains, and fresh padlocks had been added, 3 in total, each larger than the last. The denizens of Hollow Creek became even more ghostly in their rare visits. Their bodies appeared to have shrunk, and they moved in a slumped manner that conveyed an invisible weight on their shoulders. The garments they wore were now not only dark, but also shredded at the edges, hanging from their bodies like damp rags. Their faces, when momentarily visible beneath heavy hoods, revealed an intense pallor that contrasted abruptly with the deep shadows under their eyes, giving them the appearance of persons who had not slept properly in months. The stream that gave the land its name began to exhibit increasingly alarming qualities. Its seas, always black, now appeared viscous, running more slowly than usual, and leaving oily residue on the stones of its banks. Fish that had inhabited that stream had completely disappeared, and no wild creatures approached to drink, preferring to travel further distances in search of other sources. Every now and then, bubbles in the water itself broke on the surface, releasing fumes that swiftly vanished into the chilly air. During October 1909, when the nights turned extremely frigid, witnesses reported seeing nightly processions on. The sight, hooded people traveled in single line along designated routes between the many structures while carrying lamps that gave off that eerie greenish glow. These processions traced complicated routes that formed geometric forms when viewed from elevated locations, patterns that invoked arcane symbols discovered in ancient occult literature that only a few experts in the vicinity could remotely comprehend. The trees nearest to the main house began to acquire aberrant growths on their trunks, gnarled protuberances that resembled contorted faces and expressions of silent suffering. As the branches entwined, they formed organic arches that produced dark corridors and vegetative tunnels that led to deeper areas of the property that were rarely illuminated by daylight. Leaves dropped from these trees, not in usual autumnal hues, but in variations of gray and almost dark brown, gathering on the ground in thick layers that emanated a fragrance of hastened decomposition. The soil on the land was clearly altered. In some places, the land appeared to have sunk slightly, forming small depressions that filled with dark water during rainfall. In other cases, the earth was elevated in erratic mounds that didn't match any recognized natural formation. These mounds produced a wild variety of vegetation, including species that appeared to have been transported from entirely different climes and that nevertheless flourished there in defiance of all biological laws. The domestic animals on adjoining properties developed increasingly unpredictable behaviors. Chickens refused to lay eggs when the wind blew toward Hollow Creek. Cows generated sour milk even though they were healthy and well-fed. Pigs moaned frequently during the nights, uneasy in their enclosures as if detecting some invisible threat. Cats, known for their sensitivity to the supernatural, simply abandoned neighboring fields, fleeing to more remote places where the impact of that property could not reach. Deliveries at the property's entry developed into customs. Carriers would swiftly flee and abandon their belongings, displaying defensive gestures that varied depending on their particular beliefs. Some just ran as soon as they set the gifts on the ground, while others silently prayed. No one dared touch the entrance gate or venture past the invisible line that marked the beginning of Hollow Creek's realm. Before unidentified hands arrived to retrieve the crates under the cover of darkness, they were left there for hours, often until dusk. The property now breathed a life of its own, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed linked with something far beyond human knowledge, waiting patiently while fall deepened its dismal palette over that valley lost by time. The Ozarks were blanketed in snow as winter arrived with unrelenting fury, turning the region into a silent white desolation. But Hollow Creek remained a black gash in this ice purity, a location where the snow melted as soon as it hit the ground, as if the very earth radiated an unnatural heat that defied the rules of nature. Steam surged incessantly from this cursed area, creating a persistent fog that hid the property even on the clearest days of January 1910. No one had heard or seen any work being done, but the structure appeared to have grown during the preceding months. New buildings sprang out of nowhere and blended in with the overall architectural design as if they had always been there. These structures were organized in unsettling circles around the main house, forming a sort of built labyrinth that baffled the eye of any viewer who tried to mentally trace its contours. The people who lived in Hollow Creek had all but vanished. Weeks would pass without anybody seeing them, and when they finally emerged from the property, their appearances were so fleeting and ghostly that some began to question whether there were still people living there, or whether something else had taken up residence. The windows of the main house were completely dark during the day, but at night they shone, with that strange greenish light that now seemed to have intensified, pulsing with a hypnotic regularity that paradoxically lured and repelled. The red barn had been entirely changed. Its basic construction was still discernible, but the outside walls were now coated in layers of what appeared to be a mixture of lichen, moss, and some unidentified organic material growing in fractal patterns. On moonless nights, this bioluminescent covering produced a subtle glow that created a spectacle that was both exquisite and profoundly disturbing. Sounds continued to flow from within, now more intricate and varied, producing nearly a cacophonous symphony of creaks, groans, and whispers that interwoven in a terrible composition. The trees around the home had taken on even stranger traits. Their branches suddenly grew at unfathomable angles, bending and twisting in ways that defied gravity and the regular structure of wood. Some trees seemed to have joined their trunks with nearby trees, forming arches and natural passages that formed dark pathways reaching into the depths of the surrounding forest. These trees' bark had wrinkled skin-like textures, and at times it appeared to pulse as if the sap beneath the surface were blood in live veins. Winter also introduced fresh sounds to the region. During snowstorms, as the wind howled across the mountains, it was conceivable to hear something else superimposed on this natural howl, a form of choral singing, numerous voices, creating tunes of eerie beauty by harmonizing in high and low tones. These tunes had earlier, more primeval rhythms that seemed to reverberate from bygone ages when the planet was new and untamed rather than known musical patterns. Where the snow managed to stay for a few hours before melting, the patterns in the snow near Hollow Creek produced complex designs. There were footprint-like marks that were neither recognized to be from humans nor animals. They were round imprints with radial branches, as if something with several appendages had strolled there. These markers always led from the outside buildings towards the heart of the property, concentrating on a certain place in the back, where the foliage was denser and the darkness more absolute. That expanding enigma now revolved around the covered well. The building that shielded it was now decorated with symbols etched into the wood, characters that had a profound and enigmatic meaning despite not being part of any recognized alphabet. The access-locking chains had rusted rapidly, but, ironically, appeared stronger, as though the rusting had made them more durable. A steady sound of flowing water emerged from the well, particularly on the coldest nights. Although the water table in the region was far from reaching that depth, nearby lands began to exhibit evidence of Hollow Creek's rising influence. Wells that had always delivered clean, fresh water began to generate liquids with a metallic taste and a little hazy color. Crops that should have been dormant under the snow sprouted premature shoots that were pale and malformed, unable to maintain life but refusing to die completely. Barns began to reveal brown stains on their inner walls, fungi that grew in beautiful geometric patterns and resisted all attempts at eradication. The people of the region evolved their own language to deal with the incomprehensible. Instead of discussing Hollow Creek openly, they made indirect allusions and euphemisms. The property just turned into a spot you don't visit or a breathing piece of land. By recognizing danger without explicitly identifying it, this careful lexicon served as a kind of psychological defense. During one particularly severe February night, when the temperature plunged to levels that rendered the air deadly cold, the entire Hollow Creek property was observed blazing. The entire area, not just the windows or the barn, as though the ground itself had become phosphorescent. This glow persisted till morning, visible for miles, an ominous beacon heralding something beyond human comprehension. When the sun finally rose, the illumination dissipated instantaneously, leaving the property cloaked in its normal mists, silent and inaccessible as before. Winter persisted on its unrelenting path. But Hollow Creek lived outside of seasons, outside of time, a realm where conventional norms had been suspended and replaced by something far older and more inexplicable. In the spring of 1910, Hollow Creek continued to be engulfed in its own season, one that defied natural cycles, despite the region's awakening. While flowers bloomed on the neighboring hills and birds returned to make nests, the property kept its icy and dismal aura as if caught in a precise moment in time that refused to move ahead. It became impossible to ignore how the landscape was changing. The main home now seemed larger than it originally was, its dimensions subtly altered in ways that defied perception. Rooms emerged, to have been introduced without any evident construction having taken place. Windows developed in walls that were once solid, and the entire building gave the sense of continually rearranging itself like a living entity adjusting to unseen requirements. In the mornings, the mists that shrouded the valley grew more intense, yet they now had a variety of hues. Some came in hues of pearly gray, some in grayish subtleties with violet reflections, and occasionally almost translucent mists arose with golden veins that snaked, like glowing veins through them. These changes formed a captivating visual spectacle that drew the eye, but provoked deep discomfort in individuals who studied it for a longer duration. The red barn had transformed into an entirely new building. Its basic form remained identifiable, but it was now wrapped by that bioluminescent covering that had spread fully, transforming it into a type of huge cocoon that pulsed with a life of its own. The sounds radiating from its core became more rhythmic, almost melodic, generating a steady rhythm that was both audible and tactile, resonating through the earth and piercing the bones of anybody who ventured too near. The secondary structures dispersed over the property began to show signs of concerted activity. Lights flickered on and off in sequences that seemed to follow some planned pattern, as if conveying coded messages to each other. Smoke erupted from invisible chimneys, forming columns that entwined in the air before dissipating, creating ephemeral figures. It resembled almost identifiable shapes before dissipating into the breeze. The people who lived in Hollow Creek were now practically legendary. No one saw them clearly anymore, only flashes of movement in the darkness. Footsteps on deserted porches, silhouettes that momentarily materialized in windows before vanishing. When they were occasionally heard, their voices seemed to come from various directions at once, reverberating in a way that suggested they were present in multiple locations at once, as if they had learned to be at numerous places at once. The stream that gave the property its name had totally shifted its course throughout the winter. It now wound its way across the terrain in patterns that created inconceivable curves and spirals, sometimes flowing in ways that defied gravity, rising to minuscule heights before falling again. Their waters had turned absolutely opaque, a liquid ink that absorbed all the light that touched their surface, producing a river of liquid blackness cutting through the countryside. The trees resumed there. Strange change. Some had developed what looked to be eyeballs, nodules in the bark that reflected light in an unsettling way, giving the sense that the forest was studying everything with hushed and attentive attention. Branches suddenly grew entangled in complex geometric patterns, generating constructions reminiscent of natural Gothic cathedrals, organic architecture that defied any conventional botanical explanation. During the April nights, when the crescent moon illuminated the valley, shadows danced across the property without any apparent source. These shadows moved independently of any solid object, gliding across the ground, climbing walls, intertwining in complex choreographies that mesmerized any observer. They all appeared to have a consciousness of their own, avoiding obstacles and interacting with one another in ways that suggested communication and purpose. Some were short and voluminous, while others were long and thin. A particularly unsettling feature had emerged in the property's soil. In certain spots, the ground seemed to breathe, slowly expanding and contracting like enormous lungs. This breathing was notably noticeable after rain, when puddles collected, and were then absorbed in a rhythmic pulse that generated circular waves in the motionless water. The rhythm of this breathing coincided exactly with the sounds emanating from the barn, as if the entire property was synchronized in a single living organism. Deliveries to the property entrance were now made exclusively at dawn, when Hollow Creek's influence seemed momentarily weakened. Before approaching, porters created complex rituals, carrying talismans and amulets from various traditions and whispering words of protection in multiple languages. Nevertheless, many declined to perform the service because they would rather forfeit payment than jeopardize their sanity in that cursed location. The wild animals of the region had established an invisible perimeter around Hollow Creek. Once grazing in nearby clearings, the deer now stayed miles away. Bears that hibernated in caves in the surrounding hills awoke and migrated to more distant territories. Even insects seemed to avoid the area, creating an unnatural zone of silence where the usual buzzing of bees and the chirping of crickets were completely absent. Properties nearby started to go unoccupied. After generations of resistance, families finally gave in to mounting fear and fled during the night, leaving behind homes and land without turning around. These abandoned properties quickly fell into accelerated ruin, as if the absence of human presence allowed. Hollow Creek's influence to expand, consuming structures and transforming them into extensions of that distorted reality that dominated the valley. Spring was advancing in the outside world, but Hollow Creek existed in a dimension of its own, a pocket of alternate reality, where the laws of nature had been rewritten by forces that transcended human comprehension, waiting patiently as its mystery deepened into ever more impenetrable layers. Summer returned with long, hot days, but the sunlight seemed to deliberately avoid Hollow Creek, even at midday, when the sun was at its zenith, and generously illuminated the entire Ozark region. The property remained shrouded in constant twilight, as if an invisible layer filtered the sun's rays before they could touch that cursed land. This perpetual darkness created a violent contrast with the surrounding landscapes, clearly demarcating the boundaries of a territory where different rules governed existence. The structures of the property had reached a state of almost complete transformation. The main house now appeared to be made of a different material than the original wood, its surface acquiring a texture reminiscent of polished stone in some places, and something organic and malleable in others. The walls undulated subtly when viewed from the outside, but remained static under direct gaze, creating a disconcerting illusion that made observers question their own sanity. The barn had grown into a colossal building that defied its appearance. Observers swore that its interior must be several times larger than its external dimensions suggested, based on the sounds that echoed from its depths and the amount of time it took to traverse from one end to the other during the rare moments when its doors briefly opened. The bioluminescent covering now pulsed in complex patterns that seemed to convey information, a visual language of light and shadow that mesmerized anyone who contemplated it for more than a few seconds. During July 1910, atmospheric phenomena began to manifest exclusively over Hollow Creek. In perfectly clear skies, clouds appeared out of nowhere, concentrating directly over the property and slowly spinning in spiral patterns. These formations never produced conventional rain, but occasionally released precipitation of a different nature, droplets that seemed denser than ordinary water, and that upon touching the ground left iridescent stains that remained visible for days before being absorbed by the hungry earth. The sounds emanating from the property evolved into something that transcended mere noise. Complex harmonies floated through the valley during the nights. Melodies that seemed to have been composed by non-human intelligences using musical scales that the human ear was not designed to process adequately. These compositions provoked intense physical reactions in those who listened to them, ranging from nausea and dizziness to trance-like states where time seemed to slow down and reality took on the qualities of a fevered dream. The shadows on the property had taken on a substance of their own. They were no longer mere absences of light, but entities with a tangible presence that moved with purpose and apparent intelligence. These shadows interacted with the physical environment in impossible ways, leaving marks on surfaces pushing small objects, creating patterns in the ground that persisted even in direct sunlight. Some had vaguely humanoid forms, others resembled unknown animals, and some were simply amorphous masses of concentrated darkness that floated at eye level. The well at the back of the property had become the epicenter of strange activity. The structure covering it had been completely engulfed by vegetation growing in descending spirals, creating an inverted cone of intertwined plants that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Sounds emerged from the depths with increasing regularity. Not only running water, but also distant echoes reminiscent of voices singing in unison, ghostly choruses rising from the bowels of the earth in eternal reverberation. The secondary buildings had multiplied again overnight, springing up in places where previously there had only been empty ground. These new structures followed impossible architecture, with angles that hurt the eyes when observed directly, and proportions that changed depending on the point of view. Some seemed larger on the inside than on the outside. Others appeared to exist only partially in nearby dimensions, with their edges appearing to vibrate between various states of reality. The residents of Hollow Creek had become completely ethereal. Testimony spoke of translucent figures, flowing through thick walls, of presences that could be sensed but not seen, of sounds whispering directly into the mind without going via the ears. The distinction between the living and specters had become impossible to determine, and many began to believe that the original inhabitants of the property had ceased to exist in any conventional sense, converted into something other through processes that eluded comprehension. The plants surrounding the site developed characteristics that suggested communal consciousness. trees bent in specific directions as if pointing to points of interest. The grass rippled in patterns that resembled writing in an unidentified language, and shrubs emerged, creating obstacles on certain roads and opening passages on others. Flowers entirely reversed their natural cycle, blooming at midnight and withering at dawn in response to stimuli unrelated to temperature or sunlight. The Blackwater stream had become a throbbing artery, fueling the entire property with something deeper than basic. Water. Its course now formed a complicated symbol when viewed from elevated locations, an enormous glyph engraved into the terrain itself through liquid channels flowing in mathematically perfect patterns. Where the waters met the ground, the earth altered into a different substance, more flexible and receptive, as if being readied for some grand, yet-to-be-revealed purpose. Abandoned properties in the surrounding area began to be reclaimed by Hollow Creek. Structures that had been left behind were progressively consumed by the growing odd influence, their walls clothed in the same bioluminescent plants, their interiors filled with the same colored mists. Their land became part of the steadily expanding but unstoppable territory. The estate was growing, gaining ground inch by inch, and turning everything it came into an extension of its warped reality. The entire property appeared to vanish from everyday reality on new moon evenings when it was absolutely dark. Observers reported they saw nothing but black emptiness in the direction where they knew Hollow Creek existed, an absence so deep that it consumed even the starlight. And then, when the first light of morning touched the horizon, the property would instantaneously resurface, as if returning from some parallel universe where it spent its darkest hours. Zama resumed its inexorable trajectory for the rest of the globe, but Hollow Creek existed beyond the seasons and beyond time, a nexus where various realities collided and intermingled in an inconceivable tapestry of mystery and profound dread. Hollow Creek was unaffected by the seasonal shifts, even though autumn had returned to the Ozarks and painted the hills with its distinctive palette of ochres and purples. Temperature, humidity, and even the passage of time appeared to follow principles completely different from those regulating the outside world in the estate's own microclimate, a bubble of other reality. Visible energy was always vibrating in the air surrounding the mansion. Ripples that warped the image like heat rising from heated asphalt, yet cool to the touch. The architectural alterations reached a surreal apex. Structures that were once clearly delineated now melded into one another, producing a linked complex of structures that seemed to have developed organically rather than been manufactured. Corridors developed where there had once been solid walls. Staircases formed connecting levels that shouldn't exist, and doors opened onto areas that contradicted Euclidean geometry. Rooms whose corners didn't add up to the correct angles, and whose dimensions altered based on the direction of the gaze. The barn had become something completely transcendent. Its initial structure was completely covered beneath layers of development that appeared simultaneously mineral, vegetal, and something indefinable that didn't fit into any known biological category. The light radiating from its surface now included colors that didn't exist in the typical visible spectrum, indications that the human brain attempted to process but failed, resulting in visual perceptions that generated acute sensory disorientation and occasionally nosebleeds in sensitive observers. During September 1910, the property's actions worsened substantially. A never-ending chain reaction of supernatural experiences that overlapped in ever-increasing complexity was created by events that had previously happened infrequently. The ground was permanently covered in tiered layers of various colors that moved autonomously and flowed in their own unique ways, direction and producing visual effects that resemble ground-level auroras. A continuous symphony of intertwined frequencies emerged from the noises. Water in containers formed standing wave patterns. Mid-range frequencies floated in the air, producing complex harmonies. Bass layers vibrated through the subsoil, and treble frequencies approached ultrasonic registers, causing crystals to resonate. This continual ambient music caused an altered state of mind in anyone who remained. Within its audiary range for extended periods, creating visions of inconceivable landscapes and geometries that existed only in higher dimensions. The depth of the shadows was almost tangible. They were now physically interacting with items, arranging fallen branches in intricate geometric patterns, stacking small stones into precisely balanced cans, and even making impressions in soft ground that implied real form and weight. Some shadows had started to move like people, taking regular steps, gesturing with arms like appendages and rotating as though they were paying close attention to their surroundings. The well at the back had become a vortex of concentrated paranormal activity. The conical structure of plants that covered it now gently rotated in eternal motion, creating a captivating visual maelstrom that irresistibly pulled the sight and attention. Sounds coming from the depths became discernible words, pieces of languages dead for millennia, whispers and tongues that preceded human writing, vocalizations. It conveyed implications that the conscious mind could not fathom, but that the subconscious absorbed and processed in unsettling nightmares. The secondary structures started to shift, albeit slowly and subtly, over the course of several days and weeks. A building, at a specific distance from the main home, progressively got closer to millimeters each hour until it finally blended in with the bigger structure. Others cycled around the terrain in leisurely circles, following elliptical trajectories that created patterns when mapped, designs that resemble extraterrestrial planetary system astronomy diagrams. The species that had avoided Hollow Creek for so long began to be pulled back, but altered. Birds who flew over the property acquired plumage in unusual colors, electric blues and reds that glowed in the dark. Small mammals who mistakenly exceeded the borders emerged with eyes that reflected light in star-like patterns, and changed behaviors that made them travel in concentric circles instead of straight lines. Insects evolved bioluminescence, creating swarms that at night looked like living constellations hovering among the trees. The Blackwater stream had branched into several tributaries that did not physically exist, but could be seen as dark lines hovering a few centimeters above the actual earth. Phantom water flows in intricate three-dimensional patterns across the atmosphere. Marks appeared as though actual water had flowed, where these ethereal currents crossed the solid earth. Moist creases that never dried, and in the moonlight it sparkled gently. Nearby, abandoned properties had been fully integrated. What were once recognizable farms and houses were now indistinguishable extensions of Hollow Creek, transformed into components of the larger organism that the property had become. Their structures merged into the altered landscape, their land incorporated into the expanded territory, their histories erased and rewritten by the invasive presence that consumed everything in its gradual yet relentless path. During stormy evenings when lightning ripped across the sky and thunder rattled the hills, Hollow Creek answered with its own electrical spectacular. Luminous discharges emerged from the ground instead of descending from the clouds, columns of energy spiraling skyward before dissipating into the atmosphere. The air was filled with ozone and something else as a result of these explosive discharges, a smell that inspired recollections of places never visited and times never lived, alactory triggers for encounters that existed solely in parallel worlds. The original occupants of Hollow Creek, if they could still be called that, had entirely transcended recognizable physical existence. Testimonies spoke of many presences that seemed to be simultaneously everywhere on the premises. Distributed consciousnesses that had blended with the terrain itself, becoming an intrinsic part of the phenomenon rather than separate spectators. Their wills created the local reality. Their intentions materialized in bodily modifications. Their thoughts resonated through the structures like architectural whispers. Autumn was progressing outside, yet within the limits of Hollow Creek, all seasons existed simultaneously. Fragments of spring where impossible flowers bloomed beside areas of winter, where snow drifted constantly. Adjacent to regions of fall where leaves in non-existent colors fell in infinite temporal loops, were pockets of summer where the air was deformed by undulating heat. The property was now a mosaic of disparate realities pieced together to create a three-dimensional patchwork quilt that defied all logic and reason. Blizzards in the winter of 1911 turned the Ozarks into a gloomy landscape straight out of a fairy tale. But Hollow Creek had entirely lost any connection to the natural world. The property now existed as an anomaly observable even from large distances, a point of distortion in the fabric of reality, where all known laws of physics, biology, and chemistry had been rewritten by forces functioning according to principles utterly alien to human experience. The structures of the site had attained a state of permanent architectural flux. Like living membranes, walls moved and breathed. Roofs remade themselves into fractal designs that repeated eternally on diminishing scales, while foundations pulsed with rhythms that synced with the heartbeats of close spectators. The main house had enlarged unimaginably, its exterior now exhibiting hundreds of windows where before there had been only dozens, each affording glimpses of interiors that seemed to exist in completely separate regions. Chambers that exhibited landscapes of strange deserts, oceans of phosphorescent liquids, and skies populated by unknown stars. The old red barn had totally disappeared under layers of metamorphosis, becoming an organic cathedral of enormous proportions. Its structure now reached heights that contradicted its exterior dimensions, towers and pinnacles that soared towards the sky but somehow remained invisible when viewed from certain angles. The bioluminescence that coated its surface had developed to show moving pictures, scenes that expressed stories in a visual language that transcended words, narratives of civilizations that existed in ages before the creation of humans, stories about worlds that revolved around long-extinct stars. During January, atmospheric phenomena of unparalleled severity began to appear. Over Hollow Creek, impossible-colored auroras danced non-stop. Bright ribbons that not only shined but sang, generating pure tones that resonated with fundamental frequencies of the universe. These auroras were not reflections of solar activity, but emanations of the property itself, pure energy being unleashed in a visual extravaganza that could be seen even during the day, competing with the sun in intensity and startling beauty. Layers of colored mists had formed, giving the impression of endless depth. Looking through these mists was like observing through piled colored glass, each layer exposing new dimensions of the superimposed reality people moved in these depths. Silhouettes of beings that did not belong to this plane of reality. Forms that proposed non-Euclidean geometry for anatomy. Entities that left light trails as they moved and whose dimensions varied according to the viewing angle. Bright paths that lingered in the atmosphere for several minutes before gradually disappearing. The sounds pouring from Hollow Creek had formed a language of their own. No longer merely noises or tunes, but intricate communication that transferred notions directly to the awareness of the listener, eliminating the necessity for language translation entirely. Ideas about the multidimensional nature of reality. Revelations regarding the true structure of time as a nonlinear entity. Knowledge regarding the interconnectivity of all consciousnesses through unseen substrates pervading the cosmos. These broadcasts were simultaneously enlightenment and madness. Understandings that the human mind had not evolved to process, but which were driven into the consciousness of everybody within reach. The darkness had progressed beyond being physically present. They now revealed different personalities, behavioral patterns that suggested identity and purpose. Some appeared inquisitive, moving cautiously toward onlookers like untamed creatures assessing their safety. Others were more forceful, erecting physical barriers of darkness that barred particular routes while opening passageways in the directions they wanted guests to go. And some seemed like guardians, placing themselves in precise spots and remaining still like watchful sentinels, guarding unspoken secrets. The anomaly as a whole now revolved around the well. The conical foliage that covered it now soared skyward in a structure resembling enormous helix DNA, two interwoven spirals whirling in opposite directions, creating a visible force field that distorted light and space around it. Sounds coming from its depths now contained harmonies of numerous voices singing in perfect synchronization. A choir of thousands that seemed to come not from below, but from all directions simultaneously, as if the very space around the well were vocalizing, vibrating at frequencies that made bones resonate and teeth ache slightly. Secondary buildings had multiplied exponentially, but now many existed partially in distinct phases of reality. At some periods of the day, structures were clearly visible. At other times, they were translucent or entirely invisible. Some were only visible in the periphery and vanished when viewed up close. Others were solid to the touch, but translucent to the eye. Some appeared to be in a state of perpetual transition, blinking in and out of existence at a regular cadence that produced an unsettling stroboscopic impression. The greenery around the land had established a live barrier that surrounded the entire changed territory. Trees grew entwined, building impassable walls of trunks and branches that pulsed with luminescent sap, providing a clearly defined barrier between the normal world and the altered realm of Hollow Creek. This barrier was not immobile, but progressively spread outward, expanding the anomaly's realm centimeters by day, conquering virgin ground and transforming it into an extension of the greater phenomena. The phantom stream has multiplied into a sophisticated, three-dimensional network of ethereal currents moving through the air in patterns that form geometric structures when observed in their entirety. Instead of water, these currents conveyed something more basic: liquid energy that flashed in shades of deep blue and left trails of shimmering particles along its path. Other worlds, other realities, and other universes existing in parallel may be viewed through knots of higher intensity where these currents converged, where reality appeared especially thin and divided only by increasingly transparent dimensional membranes. On full moon nights, when the landscape was illuminated by a silvery light, Hollow Creek revealed facets of itself that are typically concealed. For a brief while, invisible structures became visible, showing inconceivable architecture that existed in higher dimensions, partially projected into our three-dimensional universe. Bridges that connected buildings through the air without physical supports, towers that extended simultaneously upwards and downwards, defying gravity, and circular portals that hovered vertically, displaying vistas of areas that were clearly not part of the Ozarks or even planet Earth. The original occupants had become living myths, scattered consciousnesses that pervaded the full width of the changed property. Their presence could be felt as an emotional weight in the air, intentions that emerged as abrupt impulses in visitors, mental whispers that were not their own ideas but external communications received telepathically. These beings were no longer human in any traditional sense. They had surpassed biological boundaries and become something closer to living notions, ideas that possessed their own agency and will. The altered fauna had evolved habits that indicated improved intelligence. Birds flew in exact geometric formations that generated shadows with symbolic significance when projected onto the ground. Small mammals constructed tiny buildings that were scaled-down versions of the larger property's architecture. As though in direct connection with the larger structure, bioluminescent insects created clouds that pulsed in patterns that precisely matched the light outputs from the converted barn. On the borders of the enlarged area, the assimilated properties had been entirely redone. What were previously conventional farms were now organic extensions of Hollow Creek, each adding its own individual note to the wider symphony of the collective phenomena. Barns became observatories from which inconceivable light emerged in beams that swept throughout the night sky. Houses converted into energy hubs where alternate universes briefly intersected before diverging again. Cultivated fields became gardens of organic crystals that grew in self-similar fractal patterns at all. Scales. During winter storms, when snow and hail pummeled the region, Hollow Creek stayed in an inconceivable bubble of quiet. Precipitation just stopped as it reached the edge of the property, ice crystals solidifying in the air and hanging there like immobile ornaments in an unseen orb that covered the whole area. This barrier caused the winds that howled across the nearby mountains to stop, creating a completely silent area where noises from the outside world could not be heard. All that was audible was the property's internal noise. The electrical discharges that ascended from the earth during storms had become occurrences of horrifying beauty. Lightning bolts inverted in hues that did not exist in the regular spectrum. Infrared red and ultraviolet green are tones that human perception attempted but was unable to comprehend, resulting in visual sensations that could not be accurately expressed in human language. The sky was temporarily marked by these discharges, and the atmosphere itself sustained burns as scars that were bright for hours before progressively disappearing. Time within the bounds of Hollow Creek had become fully nonlinear. Observers reported concurrently experiencing several temporal moments, seeing past and future copies of the characteristic superimposed on the present configuration. Constructions existed in states of construction, full usage, and crumbling ruin all at once. Temporal layers piled like transparencies, providing glimpses into the whole history of any building in a single, thorough gaze. Individuals who spent extended time around the site returned with muddled memories of events that had not yet happened, or that likely would never happen in traditional time frames. Winter continued its course in the outside world, but Hollow Creek existed beyond and through all seasons simultaneously, a temporal nexus where past, present, and future coexisted in macroscopic quantum superposition, awaiting the moment of final convergence that inexorably approached with each beat of the pulsating heart of the changed Earth. We have reached the end of this voyage through the mysteries of Hollow Creek, a realm that lived beyond the borders of comprehension, where reality bent and refracted into forms that contradicted everything we know about the natural world. The feature continued to serve as a silent reminder that there are layers of reality beyond our comprehension, dimensions that cohabit with our own, and are only divided by imperceptible veils that periodically become translucent. What began as a basic secluded property in the Ozarks morphed into something altogether else throughout those amazing months. Hollow Creek became a half-open doorway between realms, a point of convergence where different realities touched and intermingled in a tapestry of impossibilities. The shifts we experienced were not just physical, but also mental alterations in the very nature of what it is to exist in a certain area and time. The house that breathed, the glowing barn, the sentient shadows, the well that sang in old voices. All these manifestations were signs of something greater happening in that neglected valley, something that suggested the universe is far stranger and more magnificent than our limited intellect can properly understand. Hollow Creek served as a reminder that certain mysteries stay unsolved, not because there isn't enough evidence to explain them, but rather because the mystery itself is beyond our grasp. The residents who had resided there become an intrinsic part of the phenomenon. Their mind intermingled with the changed earth in ways that utterly blurred the borders between observer and observed, between occupant and ecosystem. They did not disappear, but transformed, evolved into something beyond traditional human existence, becoming guardians of truths that possibly should not be fully told. The property continues to exist in that dimension of its own, a pocket of parallel reality, where the laws are different and where the impossible is simply the ordinary. Perhaps it is still there, hidden in some secluded valley, waiting quietly as the world around it changes and evolves. Or perhaps it has entirely transcended our reality, escaping into one of the numerous parallel realities that exist adjacent to ours, observable only in rare occasions when the conditions are perfectly right. What we leave behind in completing this story is the realization that the world is immensely more complex than it appears on the surface. That there are locations when natural rules bend and break where the fabric of reality is thinner and more pliable. One of those locations was Hollow Creek, a unique location on the map of life where the unusual was the norm rather than the exception. And perhaps it is the true lesson of this awful voyage, that we must keep our minds open to alternatives that defy rational explanation, that the universe includes mysteries that may never be fully exposed, that there is beauty and dread in equal measure in areas where human comprehension reaches its limitations, and finds only stillness and shadows reacting in return. Hollow Creek, a story of metamorphosis and transcendence that serves as a reminder of the frailty of our reality perception, is still a whispered tale in dark nights. The noises that conveyed meanings beyond words, the dancing shadows, the vibrant mists. All of this still exists somewhere inaccessible to the general public, waiting for individuals courageous or stupid enough to pursue truths that live on the periphery of reality. If this tale impacted you, if it sparked your curiosity about the mysteries that inhabit the forgotten corners of the world, consider subscribing to this channel. There are still a ton more untold tales to share, other locations where the unexplainable has altered the scenery and people's memories. Leave a comment giving your thoughts on Hollow Creek. If you like this trip through the shadows, don't forget to hit like on the video.